We're going to learn Perek Aleph, Mishnah Yud Aleph, the last Mishnah of the Perek. This Mishnah will have two parts. The first part of the Mishnah will discuss the roof of a sukkah. We already learned in the past that the minimum height of a sukkah is that it must be 10 tfachim tall, at least 30 inches. The minimum width and length of a sukkah is that it must be at least 7 by 7 tfachim, 21 by 21 inches. And the minimum width of the roof of a sukkah is that it must be at least 1 tefach, 3 inches. Now, our Mishnah will discuss what happens if a person builds a sukkah in a way where it does not have a designated roof. And the Mishnah brings two examples. Example number one is if a person builds a hut, which means they take material that is kosher schach, and they use that material as 4 walls that all of them lean on each other, and at the very top, it is coming to a point and it does not have a flat surface of 1 tefach. Or the second example of the Mishnah is if a person takes material that is kosher schach and he leans that material against the wall, where the same thing at the top of this material, the point that touches the wall, is not a flat surface that's 1 tefach. So says the Mishnah that we have a machlokes. The first opinion, Rabbi Eliezer, says that this sukkah is not kosher because the sukkah does not have a roof with the minimum width of 1 tefach. However, the second opinion, the Chachamim hold that this sukkah is kosher because they consider the walls of the hut and they consider the material that is leaning against the wall as a slanted roof, and therefore the roof does have a 1 tefach width, and this sukkah is considered to be kosher. The second part of the Mishnah will discuss whether I can use a reed mat as schach for my sukkah. Now, we already learned in Perek Aleph, Mishnah Dalet, that there are 3 conditions for something to be kosher material for schach. Number 1 is that it must grow from the ground. Number 2, that it must be disconnected from the ground. And number 3 is that it must be something that is not able to become tamei. So the question is a reed mat something that is able to become tamei? So our Mishnah will have a machlokes. The first opinion, the Tanna Kama, says that it depends on the size of the mat. If the mat is very large, then we generally assume that the mat was made to be used for schach, which means that it cannot become tamei, and therefore I can use it as schach for my sukkah. However, if I know that this large reed mat was made with the intention for someone to lie on it, then this mat is able to become tamei, and I would not be allowed to use it as schach for my sukkah. However, if the mat was small, then we generally assume that it was made with the intention for a person to lie on it, which means that it is able to become tamei, and I am not allowed to use it for my sukkah. However, if I know that it was made with the intention for it to be used as schach, then it cannot become tamei, and I am allowed to use it for my sukkah. However, the second opinion, Rabbi Eliezer argues and says that it doesn't matter if the reed mat was small or if it was big. We generally assume that it was made with the intention for a person to lie on it, which means that it can become tamei, and a person is not allowed to use it as a schach. However, if we know that the person who made it, whether it was small or it was big, made it with the intention for it to be used for schach, then it cannot become tamei, and I am allowed to use it as schach for my sukkah. We are now going to read the Mishnah inside. The first part of the Mishnah, someone who makes his sukkah, where there isn't a designated roof. And there are 2 examples. Number 1, kimin, like a sort, tzrif, of a hut. Or example number 2, or shesmacha, who leaned he leaned kosher schach material, la kaisel, to the wall. So we have a machlokes. Opinion number 1, Rabbi Eliezer, poisel. Rabbi Eliezer holds that the sukkah is pasul mipnei because she'ein la gag. It has no roof that is a minimum of 1 tefach wide. However, the second opinion, v'chachamim machshirin, the chachamim say that this sukkah is kosher because we view the walls of the hut and the material leaning against the wall as a slanted roof. The second part of the Mishnah says the Tanakama, that machzeles kanim gedolim, that if a person makes a large reed mat, then generally we assume that it was made for schach, which means that it is kosher to be used for your sukkah. However, if asa, he made it lishchiva, for lying down, then mikabeles tuma, it can become tameh, ve'ein mesachkin ba, and a person is not allowed to use it for his schach. However, if the reed mat is small, then we generally assume that it was made for lying down, which means that it can become tameh and a person is not allowed to use it for his sukkah. But if lasikuch, he made the small mat for schach, then misachin ba, we can use it for schach, ve'ena mekabelas tuma, and it cannot become tameh. However, the second opinion, Rabbi Eliezer says that achas ketana, whether it is small, the achas gedola, or whether it is large, asa, we assume that he made it lishchiva, for lying down, and therefore mekabeles tuma, it can become tameh, ve'ein misachin ba, and we cannot use it for schach. However, if we know whether the mat was small or it's big, that lasikuch, he made it with the intention to be used for schach, then misachin, but we can use it for schach, ve'ena mekabeles tuma, and it cannot become tameh.